Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
One more time. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Wonderful. That was a very nice, warm welcome. I am Toussaint Lossier, Associate Professor in the Afro-American Studies Department, and I have the honor of being the Director of the Social Thought and Political Economy Program, also known as STEPIC. Can we get a round of applause for STEPIC? In a moment, I'll introduce you to STEPIC's Associate Director, Graciela Monteagudo, who will provide a full introduction to our esteemed guest and special friend of the STEPIC program, Professor Silvia Federici. We're honored to welcome Professor Federici back to UMass Amherst campus. I just want to say a few brief words first, though, about STEPIC. STEPIC is an interdisciplinary major in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. STEPIC faculty come from across the disciplines: economics, political science, history, women, gender, and sexuality studies, anthropology, and Afro-American studies, just to name a few. STEPIC was founded 50 years ago, emerging out of the social movements, bringing engaged radical scholarship to the university. Our program's motto, "Understand the World, Change It," is a paraphrase of Marx's 11th Theses on Feuerbach. Hitherto, philosophers have sought merely to understand the world. The point is to change it. For STEPIC and our students, it's important for us to understand the world, to have a sense of how it operates, how it works, and to learn to build our capacities to communicate the knowledges learned and produced in our classrooms to wider and broader audiences. So I don't know how many of you all have taken STEPIC courses. I'm not quite sure. I recognize a few faces. Not sure how many of you all are STEPIC majors. Maybe can we get a show of hands? How many of you guys have taken STEPIC classes?
Yes.
All right, wonderful, wonderful. Well, want to encourage those of you all who did raise your hands to continue taking STEPIC classes, no matter how unpunctual your professor is at times in class. The professor's going to work on that. And also want to encourage those of you who haven't taken STEPIC classes to consider doing so. STEPIC is really a special feature of our campus community here, and we want to welcome everyone to consider it, engage with us, and learn alongside us. I'm going to pass it to Professor, my Associate Director, Professor Graciela, and we'll have a couple of other introductions before we finally arrive at our keynote speaker. So Graciela is going to be joining us via Zoom from Argentina, and is going to share a couple words.
Thank you, Toussaint. Good evening, everyone. How's the mic? It's okay? Okay, good. I'm Catherine Moose. I'm an assistant professor in economics here at UMass, and I teach in the STEPIC program very happily, proudly. It is such a pleasure to get to welcome Silvia back to campus, and it's an honor to get to introduce her today. As you all probably already know, Silvia is a scholar, a writer, an activist, and a comrade. She's Professor Emerita at Hofstra University in New York. Luckily for us, Silvia is also a frequent guest speaker at UMass Amherst due to her long-standing relationship with STEPIC. Silvia's political work and intellectual legacy are enormous in influence and importance. She's one of the most important feminist Marxist theoreticians. Her work has made contributions in a wide range of disciplines, including history, political philosophy, political economy, and others. In 1972, with Maria Rosa de la Costa and Selma James, she co-founded the International Feminist Collective, the organization that launched the Wages for Housework Campaign. Her provocative, incisive writing, which demanded remuneration for women's work and reproducing the working class, launched what in Marxian economics, my field, is known as the domestic labor debates. In many ways, it helped propel Marxist feminist political economy as a research program. The intellectual heir of the domestic labor debates, contemporary social reproduction theory, constitutes an extremely influential strand in Marxist feminist thinking today. Nearly every year since I've been teaching at UMass, I read Silvia's work with my students, both PhD students, some of whom are in the room, and my STEPIC students. And what strikes me again and again is how her writings contain challenging and confrontational ideas that lead to fruitful and exciting conversations. I'm always surprised by my students' reactions to Silvia's work because they're varied, complex, and deep. Many students have not ever considered housework or sexuality in the terms that Silvia describes them until they read her books and essays. They don't always agree with her arguments, although they often do, but they always learn something. And so do I, which is why I reread Silvia's work over and over again. Caliban and the Witch, which is arguably Silvia's most well-known book, frames the expropriation of women's unpaid labor as a historical precondition to the rise of capitalism and exploitative wage labor. Rather than consider capitalism as a progressive stage beyond feudalism, she interprets capitalism as a reactionary fight in the historical struggle over the commons. Violence is central to the systematic subjugation of women and the appropriation of reproductive labor. She ties this to colonial expropriation and provides a framework for understanding the work of modern institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank, in engaging primitive accumulation and privatization of the commons. In March 2022, Silvia was among 151 international feminists signing Feminist Resistance Against the War, a manifesto in solidarity with feminists in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She's here today to talk about a different war, about the genocide in Gaza, and these horrific times of catastrophic violence, colonial oppression, and repression, also here at the university. We need voices such as Silvia's. Please join me in welcoming her and her remarks.
And thank you to Graciela, to that she can be here tonight with us, and to Sam and to the STEC program who has invited me so many times to this campus. And I've always been very happy to be here because I've always had very rewarding conversation with you, and I look forward tonight to hear your thoughts about these terrible times that we are living and what to be done. So what I'm going to do tonight is to first try to explain what I mean by a war on reproduction, how that connects with the situation we're witnessing in Palestine, and above all, what kind of struggle, what kind of movement can we organize, can we mobilize for, and so that never again we have to see the kind of destruction, the kind of genocidal politics that we are now witnessing every day. I'm going to read part of what I've written. I've been very tired, very exhausted in recent time, and therefore I do something that normally I do not. I don't speak, I fear speaking extemporaneously about forgetting things that I might want to say. But there will be a lot of time for discussion. I want to dedicate my talk to Maria Mies, a feminist who throughout her life insisted that feminism is not just a chapter to be added to an already existing social theories, but is a self-subsistent system of thought from which we can understand and evaluate every aspect of social life and culture. Maria Mies, as you probably know, if you don't know her, you should definitely read her work because it's ever more important. Today is particularly important. She died in the spring of 2023, and this was a really great loss for the feminist movement internationally. Mies also taught us that feminism should not be concerned only with changing the position of women in society, but should aim to change society itself. And to do that, feminists should struggle against every form of oppression and exploitation. In that spirit, I want to speak of the war that has been waged across the world against the means, the resources upon which we depend for our subsistence. This war is now most dramatically evident in Palestine, where Israel is subjecting Palestinians to a relentless genocidal assault, clearly determined to destroy everything that can enable them to live in their land, or even simply to have a life on this earth. Impossible here to list all the atrocities that Israel is committing in this process. Cities are in ruin, every reproductive infrastructure, home, roads, water system, crops, any other form of agriculture destroyed. More than 40,000 people killed, and we know that the number is much, much higher. Children, the hope for the future, are deliberately targeted. More than 10,000 have been killed and many more have been horribly wounded. Hospitals have been destroyed, bombed, invaded, turned into rubble. Doctors, nurses, and aid workers have been arrested or killed. The past too is being destroyed. School, university, archives, personal and public, libraries have been demolished, evidently to erase those collective memories that constitute a people's identity and connect it to a broader liberation struggle. And now people are being starved to death, and sadistically they are being shot when they are receiving food, or when they move, as they are told to do, to non-existent safe areas. A whole reproductive infrastructure is being systematically dismantled, the goal being clearly the extermination of the Palestinians, the replacement of Palestine with an enlarged Israeli state, clearly functioning as the watchguard to protect the interests of the oil companies in the region and keep at bay the legitimate struggle that people in the Middle East have been making to regain control over their lives and their land. This has been Israel's task since its formation in 1948, and the elimination of the Palestinian people has always been the objective, carried out over the years systematically, year after year, each time with more intensity. That in order to achieve this goal, the United States and the European Union are dropping any pretense to be the defenders of human rights and free speech, and are engaged in a massive effort to muzzle people and punish those who dare to acknowledge the truth, is a sign of how important the maintaining of control over the political economy of the Middle East is to the stability of international capital. It is a sign of the loss of legitimacy of these regimes, which can only have their ways through threats, punishment, and intimidation. What I want to stress now is that despite these horrific consequences and goals, the war that Israel and the United States are making against Palestine is not a unique event. In reality, we could say that Palestine today is the world. This was the title of a talk that I gave in 2002 at the Socialist Scholar Conference in New York, as I was reflecting on Israel's response to the Al-Aqsa Intifada. At the time, I wrote that, and here I quote, "The same destructive policies that Israel is implementing in Palestine, with the use of deadly force through land expropriation, the expansion of settlement, the theft of water, and now the systematic destruction of every infrastructure, water pipes, roads, power plants, sewers, schools, houses, are also being implemented with the same results in Africa, Asia, Latin America. What in Gaza is destroyed by the IDF, in many African countries is destroyed by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization. In Palestine, it is Israel, it is the Israeli tanks that are bulldozing schools and houses. In Africa, it is structural adjustment, the defunding of the public sector, currency devaluations, and the effects are the same. In Palestine, the sick the wounded, the women giving birth cannot go to the hospital because the Israelis shoot them. In Africa, people cannot go to the hospital even without the Israeli bullets, although Israel has played havoc in Africa too, propping every dictator. From Mobutu to the white South African apartheid regime. But in both cases, the results are population of refugees, the transfer of lands from the local people to the new colonial power, forwarding and protecting the interests of international capital. I wrote this in 2002 with some important changes. I could have written it in more recent weeks. Comparing the Israeli government and the Israeli army's role with that of the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO is not to underestimate what is taking place in Palestine or minimize its gravity, but is to show the continuity between Israel's genocidal war and the economic policies implemented by international capitalist country institutions that are now also blooding the world. All over the world, people are being impoverished, displaced, persecuted in their effort to resist, fight back, secure a future for themselves and for their families. Here, I normally don't post statistics, but some statistics, it's interesting. They're keeping a track. The United Nations keeping a track of how many people are malnourished, how many hungry. Chronic hunger, malnutrition is common now in Africa, Asia, Latin America. According to official statistics, billions lived in hunger in 2022. 108 million were forcibly displaced from their homelands. 300 million in 2020 became international migrants. 2,500 died crossing the Mediterranean in 2023, coming from Africa, the Middle East. 25,000 in the last year drowned. The Mediterranean now is a cemetery. Clearly, what the statistics reveal is an epochal reproduction crisis. Why so much hunger, so much poverty, so much displacement? These are questions we all have to ask. These are not cosmic crises. These are the direct result of policies consciously put in place by the leading world powers, beginning with the United States, the country in which we live. Some say that this is because capitalism is living through a crisis, that the profit that capitalists used to make selling commodities are now diminishing, particularly since the resources they can exploit are also diminishing. Capitalism is literally eating the earth. But most important is capitalism needs to colonize, need to create what I call sacrifice zones. You know, sacrifice zones. Once you go to Chile or Argentina, you actually find many areas defined. They actually define them as sacrifice zones. These are areas where, outfit companies that are especially polluting are concentrated. But actually, these are sacrificed population because these areas are not empty. These areas are very heavily populated. And so, who's being sacrificed? But what I'm saying is that capitalism needs sacrifice zones. Development, prosperity for the few requires misery for the majority. The more so as resources are now diminishing. Moreover, the historic trend of capitalism is toward towards a global process of enclosure. You know, the enclosure were those processes in 16th, 17th, 18th century Europe, England in particular, you know, in which the proto-capitalist class fenced off the communal land, pushed people off, or kept them working for the pittance, right? And basically, you know, capitalized those land, used them for crops devoted to the market. So it was the enclosure system, you know, which Marx saw as the beginning of capitalism, was really the system that separated people from the means of their reproduction, you know, turned them into dependent on wage labor, and many more, of course, didn't, you know, even obtain this work, even were not even becoming lucky enough to become wage worker. So what I'm saying is there's now at work a process of enclosure on a global scale, ensuring capital control over all the means of reproduction, you know, people's relation to the land and its resources, and allowing people to have direct access to the land only as wage workers. The United Nations has celebrated this process last year, you know, arguing that for the first time in people's history, in human history, more people lived in an urban environment. And of course the United Nations saw this as a great sign of process. Now, the more and more people are living in an urban environment, you know, I think in reality this is something of a disaster, because what it means is now companies, corporations are controlling the land. And when I mean the land, I mean rivers, you know, coastal areas, forest, you know, animal, basically all the most fantastic basic means of the reproduction of life. You know, so land is not only soil, but it's a whole vast reproductive system. And the process of constant forced urbanization is the process by which capitalism, the companies, the corporations, the international institutions are gaining control on basically the fundamental means by which life is reproduced, which means that it gives a tremendous power to control our life and to force them to accept, you know, whatever condition they decide we should accept in order to live. This is why we witness so much violence. This is why we see that we live in a state of permanent warfare, you know. Here, unfortunately, I can, because of limit of time, and I want to give as much pass to discussion, I have to be brief, but enough to say that over the last 20-25 years, the United States has been involved in a continuous process of global warfare, you know, in endless number of countries in which the United States has waged war, you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, Panama, and I will list some of them. The US has spent $4 trillion in the last 20 years in war, just in the Middle East, just in Iraq and Afghanistan, and much more in other colonial wars. In each case, targeting the infrastructure necessary for the reproduction of life, so that people who continue to die long before the bombs stop falling, also using weapons that will poison the environment for decades, like phosphorus bombs, cluster bombs, depleted uranium. And I want to read here from a book called No More War But Done, Kovarik, that you know, reports what the Commission of Inquiry for International War Crime Tribunal, which the United States basically checked what the United States was had done in Iraq. And they wrote, in every city we visited, we documented severe damages to home, electrical plant, fuel storage facilities, civilian factories, hospitals, churches, civilian airport, vehicles, transportation facility, food storage, food testing laboratories, grain silos, animal vaccination center, school, communication towers, civilian government office buildings, stores. Almost all the facilities we saw had been bombed 2 or 3 times, ensuring that they could not be repaired. Most of the bridges we saw were destroyed. They were bombed from both hands. And so, compounded by sanctions, the damage to life support system in Iraq killed more after the war than direct attacks did during the war. I want to read this to say that what we see in Palestine is exceptional in many ways, but in particular because we now see it. We now actually, this is done in the open air. This is done in a way that unless people decide to close their eyes, it is visible. We can see the misery, we can see the cities that are completely laid to waste. We can see the bombing, the result of... But much of what we see has actually happened over the years, has happened in Iraq, has happened in Afghanistan. I want to say this to basically 2 points. 2 points. One, how selective is what we are exposed to. How selective we're exposed to. We are legitimately, clearly indignated, pained, horrified by what we see. But we haven't seen the same kind of mobilization, for instance, over the years, despite the fact that many of the genocidal war that the United States, has waged, have also reproduced the same kind of crimes. Actually, since Vietnam, we have not seen any mass mobilization. And I think this is very important. And also is an alarm about what is that our movement are capable of really, in a sense, bringing to us, making us aware of. So all my talk is really now geared to what kind of movement we need to build. What kind of movement, what kind of awareness we need to raise so that we do not only concentrate on the exceptional moment or what appears as exceptional moment, but actually we realize that something very fundamental has to change, and that whatever movement we organize has to have a very broad scope and a very large vision. So, why so much violence? So much violence is a result of a world capitalist system that sustains and produces itself through a hierarchical structuring of the people it governs, such that the standard of living it provides to a small part of the world population in the so-called developed countries is based on ever-expanding impoverishment in the rest of the world. A world in which people are displaced from their land and homes to make space for mining outfit, for oil drilling, where people produce clothes and food, but not for their consumption, where labor is mostly informal, which means below subsistence level, and where violence by police, narco-traffickers, security guard, as well as armies, is the rule, because you cannot keep masses of people dispossessed without the maximum of repression. It is no accident, as I mentioned before, the US has 800 military bases, 800 military bases across the world, and for decades, either directly or through proxies or through NATO, has engaged in an uninterrupted warfare in many parts of the world. Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Panama, Haiti, Libya. Libya come in 2012, 11 cities were laid to waste in Libya, Sudan, the Sahel. A warfare that in several cases has led to the disintegration of the country into rebel faction. And in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, the death of millions. Only the power the US has, by virtue of its military apparatus, has prevented the charge of genocide being moved against its operation in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or for the matter, in Vietnam. So, two conclusions. One, colonialism has not ended. On the contrary, what we are witnessing is a massive recolonization process. Capitalism, let's insist on it, needs colonies. Spearheaded by the debt crisis, which has forced government to open their door to foreign corporations under the name of repaying the debt and economic recovery. The means have changed. Now colonialism is organized often through financial need, like the debt crisis. Now colonies can have their own flags, but their economies have been restructured according to a colonial logic that over the years has transferred the country's wealth into the hands of European and US corporations, and more recently to companies from China. If to this picture we add the impending threat of global warming and climate change, we realize we are heading to very dangerous times. We need to see also important, crucial, that the bombs that are falling on the countries of the so-called South are falling on us as well. We are paying for them. The $4 trillion that the US has spent in the Middle East over the last 20 years is all money that has been taken away from the reproductive system in the United States. The cost is paid in terms in the United States of disinvested schools and clinics, an affordable medical system, low wages, infrastructures that are falling apart, like the bridge on Baltimore. Technology leaps do not compensate for that. On the contrary, they worsen the prospect. Unlimited development for some demands misery and dispossession for many, and not only in the recolonized South, but across the world. What is to be done? And I really want to have some discussion on this issue. What is to be done? I begin here to propose with 3 recommendations that Maria Mies offers at the end of her classic work, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale. This is a book that I think is very useful to read today, because it was written in 1986, but actually the themes that it treats are really more than ever actual. One, obviously the construction of an alternative economy, of an alternative society, a society not based on the exploitation of human labor, not based on hierarchy of racism, begins with the creation of autonomous, self-sufficient economic system, providing for most of our needs and renouncing wasteful consumption. This calls for the relocalization of production, back to land movements, keeping in mind, and this is very important, that the distances, Maria Mies has insisted on this, that the distances of production and consumption, the fact that now production and consumption are more and more, are moving apart, creates in us, those of us who are on the consumption level, a lack of responsibility, as we cannot know under what condition the products that we use are produced, how much suffering they cost. If we could make an X-ray of most of the product that we see in the shops around us, and the product that we use on a day-to-day basis, we probably would have to change completely, what we do, what we consume. Because so much exploitation, so much suffering, so many of the products we use, for instance, are imported from areas where the production is in free export zone. Free export zone is a great invention of neoliberalism. It's the new form of slavery. Free export zone, there are areas, usually run by international corporations, where no labor law, no labor regulation, everything is permissible. Where people can work 10, 15 or more hours a day, sometimes late into the night. Where there's no hygienic standard enforced, very little conditions of production, particularly in the production of electronics and so forth. And where in some areas, women who work there, mostly young women, when they enter them, they have to take pills, abortions, contraceptive pills, so they don't waste, they don't run the risk of losing time of work because they become pregnant. Together with that, Maria Mies envisaged a large education campaign, that this is one task that we have, about the origins of the products that we use to make visible the exploitative practices behind these products, the tortures of humans, animals, and plants that they require. Awareness of the exploitation inherent to the commodities that we use to boost, she's always insisted, our desire for autonomy, and to connect, and our desire to connect our struggle to the struggle of the people, whose product we use. A boycott campaigns would be a natural outcome of such an awareness. 2, of course, the issue is not only control consumption, but to control production. Right? The struggle, workers struggle to influence production, decision making, refusing to produce commodities that are harmful to people or the environment, like, for example, bombs. And here I want to, communicate the good news that you probably already know, which is that the Google workers from California to New York have decided to strike against the proposed contract that Google has made with the state of Israel that will transfer a tremendous amount of technology, mostly to be used in AI, which we know is very heavily used by the military. So the question of wherever we are working, wherever we are producing, the question of struggling not only over wage and work condition and time of work, but also increasingly creating a mass movement that begins to decide what we're going to produce. And 3, building solidarity economy. We had a discussion last night about solidarity economy in the Amos area, which I'm very glad to hear are in fact thriving. But certainly solidarity economy are very strong throughout Latin America. Solidarity economy where we can reorganize the reproduction of our life in a more communal, collective way. Community-supported agriculture, time bank, care work cooperatives, are really very good beginning. But fundamentally, the drive, the struggle is to really break the isolation in which capitalism has forced us to reproduce our life. Through the nuclear family, the separate home, separate dwelling, the constant isolation, the myth of privacy. These are all initiatives, these are all strategies that do not actually enhance our happiness and well-being. They are all strategies that actually weaken us. Because when we are dealing on an individual basis, immediately we are defeated. Immediately our imagination of what is possible shrinks. It's only when we begin to connect with other people, when we begin to break the wall. There is no Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is a myth, and Robinson Crusoe had a slave. So privacy and individualism work for those who have a state backing them up. Work for those who have armies backing them up. Then they can speak about self-reliance. There is no self-reliance. The self-reliance that the capitalists and the bourgeoisie have always spoken about is the self-reliance of people who are protected by the state. For us, for most people who don't have power and desire to actually control other people's life, exploit others, instead, the importance of actually breaking down the isolation, the separation, and creating collective, communal forms of the reproduction of everyday life is not only something that is important, because the society that we should want to create has to be a society built on communalism, built on equal access to all the resources that this world offers to us, and also reciprocity between each other and reciprocity towards the earth. But also communalism, building communitarian relation, it's a condition for our struggle. It's a condition of existence for our struggle. We cannot really build strong movements that are not only strong for a moment and then dissipate, but actually can grow, unless we also begin to work in our community and create, in fact, communal relationships of all types. The importance of overcoming our isolation is fundamental. First and foremost, we need to build an anti-war movement. The anti-war movement now is fundamental. We talk about the crisis of reproduction, the war on reproduction, and an indispensable response to this war and to the possibility to create a society not built on sacrifice zone, not built on sacrifice population, is really a society that is demilitarized. So we need to build an anti-war movement. Feminist movements have a special role here, as they have also a special role in the construction of communitarian relations. When I mean of feminism, I mean of a movement that has been shaped, in its understanding, of the obstacle against which we are fighting, and the kind of society that we want to build has been shaped by the experience of generation and generation of women and other dissident subjects on the question of reproduction. The work that women have done over the century has been primarily the reproduction of everyday life. The child raising, the agriculture, very different in different countries under different conditions. But nevertheless, this work of reproduction has also created a certain subjectivity, a certain understanding. And in particular today, I think that when we look at the struggle, the work to be built from the point of view of reproduction, we can begin to see, how this can be a common ground on which many movements come together. A common ground that can help us unify different movements. Reproduction means health, it means child raising, it means agriculture, it means education, it means ensuring that we have, an environment that is not poisoning us, etc., etc. So when we speak of reproduction, we touch every aspect of our life. every aspect of our material cultural life. And in that sense, I speak of the feminist movement has to be a movement that is not alone, but more than many others, the capacity to create connection between different forms of exploitation and different forms of struggle. So first and foremost, we need to build an anti-war movement. Feminist movement have a special role here. As feminism is a movement shaped by the experience gained through the work of reproduction, it has a special role in exposing a system that makes war, killing, militarization of life, the militarization of life, its foundation. It is important that we campaign, and this is all of us, not only women, not only feminists. It is important that we campaign to convince women to leave the army, that we denounce the idea that joining the army is an emancipatory step. Actually, the goal is for everybody to leave the army. The goal is for the abolition of army, the abolition of prison, the abolition of war. So I want to conclude here, and I want to conclude that, probably some of you listening to this, we have to, build the world, the anti-war movement, we have to create communalism, we have many, I know, particularly some younger people think, oh, it's too late, or things are too far gone, or it's going to be impossible, or look, the power that they have, an enormous power. We cannot even speak freely without being punished, right? By the way, it means they are afraid. Actually, the fact that they go to such a length to muzzle people, to prevent people to say what is obvious, really shows how important these denunciations that are being made across the campuses and in so many, in cities across the world, how important they are. So this is really not to be forgotten. But I want to conclude, on a note against pessimism. Pessimism, as many have said, and I reiterate every time, is a luxury. We cannot be pessimistic about the future of the world. And regardless of what may be the result of our action, we have to act. And I think we should get inspiration. And here I want to reconnect myself to my beginning talk about Palestine. We should get inspiration by the people of Palestine, the doctors, the journalists, the mothers who day after day confronted with the reality that for me I cannot even imagine what it must be like. I cannot even imagine, for example, these doctors that without eating, without sleeping, living in a living hell, in a truly living hell, amputating children without anesthetics, their own family being massacred, they themselves risking every day their life, are continuing to be there, are continuing to fight. I think that these are our heroes today, and a great inspiration for us to see that, in fact, the horror that is being created should not be a cause for despair, but should actually be a cause to recommit ourselves to the task, which is the most important in the world, to create a better society. Thank you very much. So let's talk.
So we have an opportunity for question and answer. So if folks would be so kind, folks who do have questions, would be so kind to come up to this side of the lecture hall and line up on these stairs. We can take them one at a time. I want to make a joke about offering a question and not a comment. I feel like people have heard that before, but yeah, you can come with a question as opposed to a statement or something to that effect. That would be wonderful.
Thank you so much. Muito obrigada. I think as we resist in various parts of the world, one of the questions is who are our allies? And who are we supposed to ally with? Because it's not only that women are entering the military, it's that people who are expected to be allies are not. And thinking about Gaza, many Arab states are not supporting Gaza, as it's been published today in the news, but we know that's an old story and it's very convenient for them, right, to let Gazans die the way they're dying, being dispossessed as a tool to fight Israel, etc., or Hamas or Hezbollah. So who really are our allies? How are we to figure out who are our allies if being a woman is not enough to fight patriarchy, right? If being a black woman raising your hand against the ceasefire representing the US is not enough, right? Black faces in high places will not save us. Benjamin was talking about it a few days ago. So how do we build allyship in what direction, and what are your suggestions not to lose despair in our allyship?
Yeah, maybe 2 or 3 questions. Yeah, is another one?
My question is related to that, but how you mentioned that anti-war movement died after Vietnam War, and when we read about that, one thing that people talk about is how neoliberal capitalism sort of did the repression and just everything ended, all the as if people didn't have any agency or these movements didn't have any agency. Well, my question is, from the perspective of those anti-war movements, from the perspective of the anti-war movements and not neoliberal capitalist perspective, what mistakes they did that the anti-war movement died, and considering in the moment that we're in right now, we see a spark around, especially in US and Europe, that there has been a lot of protests and movements. What mistakes they shouldn't repeat that were done during the 1970s by the anti-war movement?
Yeah, very good. Is there any other question for the moment? Okay.
So, by the way, I'm going to give my, some ideas, and then, but I would like to also other people. These are questions for the room, obviously, no? Who are our allies? I think our allies are the broad, for example, they are now what I call a feminist insurgency in many parts of the world, particularly in Latin America. We don't see that in the United States. In the United States, the feminist movement only emerges periodically these days, when abortion is threatened. But otherwise, we don't see a massive feminist movement, in the streets, except occasionally for demonstration against violence against women. But for example, Graciela Monteagudo is in Argentina. In Argentina, we have seen in recent weeks, and actually I could say years, but in response to the horrendous legislation that Milei has adopted, we have seen millions of women in the street. We have seen a movement that is extremely massive, and not only in numbers, but is a movement that has a very broad program, because a movement that is fighting, of course, against political repression, is fighting against the new initiative of the Malay government, but over the years has fought against every issue. For instance, showing that there is a feminist movement, a family perspective around the question of death, indebtedness. That has become a curse that unites people across the world. And it's a deliberate politics, right? Implemented through low wages, implemented to easy credit at variable interest rate, etc., microcredits, which for many years was sold as a help to poor women. These have been all tools that have actually turned that into a weapon of extractivism. Extractivism of people energies, extractivism tying people to miserable jobs for years and years to come. So, for example, women in Argentina have been fighting around that, not only around for equality with men, but actually around issue of ecology. Against, for example, and I'm speaking Argentina, I could speak Brazil, I could speak Chile, against the privatization of agriculture, the industrialization of agriculture, the continuous use of fertilizer, the continuous use, the forcing people to actually use these inputs that are supposed to modernize agriculture and actually are poisoning the earth, or the forcing of monoculture. So there is a whole struggle that is taking place, not only to reclaim land with movement like the landless people of Brazil, and women have been in the forefront of those reclamations. Movement like Via Campesina for food sovereignty, so women have been very, very important. So the fight against monoculture, the fight against land privatization, the fight against land, also in labor issues. In Argentina, for example, you have an organization called La Intersindicale. This is a feminist organization, but of women who are in the union and whose task is basically struggling to make sure that the union has a certain politics, right? So I think that these are our allies. This movement that in Latin America called popular feminism, right? And similar movement you find also in Africa. These are movements with whom we certainly have to connect, because we need an international movement that are capable of coordinating our struggle. The way we have seen, for example, in the 90s with the anti-globalization movement, that for a time brought together people from Africa, brought together people from Asia, and with people in Europe, in the US, etc. This is the kind of broad coalition that we need to make. This is our and the mistake of the anti-war movement, where at the time certainly one reason why so many youth rebelled was the fact that there was a draft. That draft, in a way, forced many people to make a decision to confront the question of the war very seriously as a life and death matter. Today, in response clearly to those mobilizations, right, we have now mercenaries in a way. People who join the army are people who do it because they see, well, not only mercenaries, the mercenaries are more the ones who do the specialized jobs like assassination. But for many people, the army has become a solution to the life problem of employment in situations in which, in the US, we experience massive, unemployment, particularly in poorer communities. So I think the mistake is not to concentrate on an isolated issue. This was the point of my talk today. We fight against Palestine, but even if we had a ceasefire, even if all of a sudden there are many Palestinians in the world, Palestine is the point of my talk was that Palestine is inscribed in the system, in the social economic system in which we are living. Palestine is an inevitable element of the structure of this capitalist system, who cannot perpetuate itself, cannot accumulate except to the constant creation of hierarchy, except to the constant division among people, except the, for example, continuous redefinition of entire population as non-human. So the racism, coloniality are really part of the sinew of the system, the same as patriarchy. This is the point that I'm trying to make, so that the question of changing the system is fundamental. And the changing, what does it mean? What are the forces, in a way? And what are the terrains of struggle that are most important for this transformation? This, I think, is one of the questions that we have to ask. Any other? Yes.
Hey there.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this talk. You're a great inspiration for me, and obviously many. I'm curious about where you source courage to be able to speak so clearly and bravely and strongly against brutalization, oppression, subjugation, and sort of a second part to that is like any advice you would give for folks who want to get engaged more actively and are holding fear or contraction or constriction around using their voice and speaking up against these systems of control and domination.
Yeah, okay. Let's have 2 or 3.
Thank you so much. I have a couple questions about just like if you could speak to how to build a mass movement, any advice on that? How to make decision-making processes that can work on with more people in a democratic way, maybe people's assemblies, any advice you have on any of that, and how to dismantle hierarchy in organizing spaces, any comments on that?
Okay, maybe another one, and then, well, you might have to remind me of the yeah.
Hi, yeah, I'm really interested to know what your thoughts are on sort of modern movements that have arisen in the so-called global south, particularly like the Zapatistas and Roosevelt, more non-hierarchical movements that have emerged. I'm curious to know if you think that those are more reflective models of the kind of world that you think needs to be built and the kind of organizing. At the same time, I'm also interested to know whether you think at this point in the development of capitalism, there's really any value in efforts towards directly seizing the state by sort of militant or non-militant leftist projects, or if you think that that is a project that should basically just be left in the past. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll start from this one and then go backward. No, I don't believe about seizing the state. Seizing the state, really, I mean, we have seen, and I don't want, I really appreciate, for example, the effort that in 2012, 2014, 2015, people, about in Spain and then kind of came to the United States, did in terms of the politics of municipalism, this idea that, we don't want to take the state, but in local politics, there's more something you can control more in terms of local politics, and so you can actually work with local politics, right? But I'm very, very concerned, for instance, that so much energy is devoted to electoral politics, and that preempt other possibilities. And it seems to me that there is this dance between the Democrats and the Republicans, right? That they really need each other. It's like a marriage. It's like a bad marriage, but it's a marriage. They imagine what Biden would do without Trump. Every night I've seen kneeling and praying God that Trump remains and doesn't go to jail. Because if Trump is out of the scenario, political scenario, right? How many people will vote for Biden? So, no, I think better to leave the state, because every experiment with actually state politics has ended into those who were the subversive being incorporated into capitalist politics. So I think that the struggle should be actually to create movements that are outside, from below. And I think that very positively about the Zapatista. I'm sure there are many problems. You know, periodically they revise their own politics. Recently, I understand, for instance, they are going to another major reorganization. I've not had the time, the possibility, particularly have not been able to travel to Chiapas to understand better what is really taking place. But I think it was a very powerful movement, right? A movement that took over land, a movement that tried to communalize life, to reduce the dependence on money, not completely. They still sold coffee on the market, right? But nevertheless, they put in their program the ability to more and more reduce the dependence on money. So I think that the Zapatista, for me and for many, has been really, and they have been able also to connect with people's struggles across the world. They have not isolated themselves on the mountains of Chiapas, but they have actually periodically opened up to the international movement, bringing people and communicating. So the question of how to build a movement, I think that continuing the discussion about Latin America, right? One of the many forms of communalism that people have turned to, particularly women have turned to, and in particular women were lost, displaced from the rural area, forced to immigrate, from other countries, arriving, let's say, in Chile or in Argentina with nothing in their hand, right? And either having the choice, accept total defeat, or start collectively building something together. And in Argentina, the encampments that these people have built are called villas miseria, miserable towns, right? But actually, they are encampments of little cities, which now have grown to 50,000, many, many, very large, of people who, on arriving to the city, have decided to work together to build streets, to build shacks and then houses, to create collective kitchen, realizing that collectivity was the only possible alternative to a total defeat. So the collective kitchen, for instance, the olas comunes, the big pot, right, where a lot of people could feed and actually would expand the resources of the community. The urban garden, urban farming, working together, whatever land was available. Urban farming, by the way, is now spreading across the world. In many countries of Africa, for instance, everywhere people are farming. In the city, in between, any unoccupied piece of land is used to put a pepper, to put a carrot. So the assembly, there's been a big incentive to use assemblies. If you read, for example, Potenza Feminista, International Feminism by Veronica Gago, right? It's all built on what the assembly is. What a kind of tool the assembly, because it brings together all the people who are interested in an issue, right? Doesn't mean that they agree, right? But it begins to formulate what the issue is. to get the sense of what is the issue, and get the sense of what are the possible alternatives, what are the possible opinions, what are the people agree with this, etc. And so the assembly as a fundamental, and neighborhood assemblies, these are all tools that are important to build communities. These are all tools that are important to bring people together. I think the issue is to overcome the isolation in which people live, and to show that when you come together, some possibility. And for instance, over and over, I've heard from women who have organized in this way, and by the way, Millet is attacking this very forcibly. That's why this debating is really making an all-out attack on feminism. More and more I've heard that this kind of grassroots, on the ground, in the community form of initiative, and actually enabled women to actually confront the state, to then force the state, the local state or the federal state, to change certain policy. You know, that 500 women have been able to go together to the local, government and say, we want electricity in our neighborhood. You have to come and put water. We have these houses, you have to come and put water. You have to give us electricity. You have to do, etc. So these communal structures are not an end in itself, but they're actually a means of creating the kind of strength and solidarity which then allows you to confront the state without being destroyed. This, I think, is very important. Tell me if I've forgotten something.
Anything you have about dismantling hierarchy or...
Yeah, I think dismantling hierarchy is not to ignore that we have different experiences. And therefore we cannot have universal decision making. I mean, we had, I don't know now, but in the 70s, there was a tremendous amount of organizational discussion in the feminist movement and in the black movement, of course. The whole issue of autonomy versus separatism, right? And I know, for instance, among many, many feminist groups, the idea of autonomy, right? That you don't assume that because you're all women, you have one organization and we make collective decisions. That's why you have black feminist movement organizing on their own and demanding their autonomy, because they have experiences that are unique and they cannot be. Doesn't mean that there is a bridge. Doesn't mean that you can find a common ground. But the idea that somehow people have to decide about experiences of which they know nothing is totally absurd. So I think that respecting the autonomy, I think, is certainly an important component of dismantling not only the obvious racism, but the more subtle racism. Because racism comes in many forms. There's an obvious racism that more rarely you find in the movements. What you find is a more subtle racism that has to do with decision making, who's going to speak, who's not going to speak. Same with patriarchy. That is propagated in not direct ways, right? And so actually being able to have organizational discussion, they begin to understand who has the right to make decisions, on what basis. That kind of discussion has to be part of any movement, has to be part of any form of organization. And please remind me now that I've forgotten. Yeah.
Very understandably.
Yeah.
I was asking if you could share a little bit about sort of where you source the courage to speak so brazenly.
Well, maybe because I'm very old, and so
You've been doing it for a long time.
very little to lose. I'll be 82. In 2 days, I'll be 82. So that's the thing to be happy birthday. Not much to celebrate, to tell you the truth, particularly in this world. I was born under bombs. 42, imagine, 1942, the year of the final solution. By the time I was 9, I went to school to see the images that were coming out of the concentration camps. We saw the pile of teeth, we saw the pile, of everything. Yeah, the skulls, the ovens, etc. So this is the world. By the time I was 10, I knew that I was not in a good world. And I think that having been born in 1942 was the most formative experience in my life. First of all, my parents, for years and years and years, they didn't talk about anything else except the war. All the dangers that they escaped, all the time that they could have been killed. We were a lucky family. My mother and my father were alive at the end of the war. But so I think I've been, and I think all my life, I've seen, the desire to see another world. And there's nothing that pains me most than to leave this world soon without seeing the world that I thought we could have built when I was 20 or 25 or 30, and I thought the revolution was around the corner. I really thought for a while, believe it or not, the revolution was around the corner, that we could make it. And now, to die to see a world that we have is one of the great pains of my life. So it's the courage of pain and also the courage of old age, I guess, what I have to lose. Thank you. Good, I'm sorry.
Hello, thank you so much for your incredible talk. I wanted to ask, as feminists and leftists and as people who are building a better world, how do we confront the presence and perpetuation of misogyny in our organizing spaces, especially for women of color who are constantly spoken over or belittled or even met with violence? How do we do that in a way that is transformative and healing?
Okay. All right, I'll try. I don't have all the answers. Yeah.
Hey, so, yeah, I'm a very practical, on-the-ground sort of oriented person. I myself have done a lot in my life to try to build collectivity and mutual aid networks and etc. But something I have come up against, especially in the pandemic, is when it really comes down to making room for everybody's autonomy, the individualism rears its ugly head and tears it all apart. So, yeah, given that we are all inundated by and trained into a system of alienation in this country, what does coalition look like, but practically and interpersonally, on a smaller scale? How does that begin? And then secondly, how in our coalition work can we resist co-option? Because that's another thing I've come up with, especially in working with NGOs and so that's
yeah. Okay.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for being here. Your book, Caliban, was very transformative for me, and so it's great to hear you speak. So thanks. You talked a lot about kind of the scale of what we're up against, whether it's the piles of teeth in Jewish, so piles of teeth of Jews or mass graves that are being unearthed in Gaza and everything we're seeing there. And then you talked a little bit about kind of the state and what it looks like to build movements that can actually create a better world. And I'm curious, I came back from Venezuela this year and I had something in my mind when you were talking about that, which is something that Chavez said about that you can't build an island of socialism in a sea of capitalism. And so kind of looking a little bit, just as one, there are many examples in the world, but looking at one example, which is in Venezuela, whether it's the revolution which did take state power, or the Communard Union, which is communes all around the country, which came from a vision of Chavez, kind of with the ultimate goal of making a communal state to replace the bourgeois state. That there's very much a tension between that model and I think and the Zapatista model, where there's some interviews that came out this is the last couple of years, where they actually talked, like, interviews with communards talking about that and saying, we have a lot of respect for our comrades and stuff, but these guys are doing really great work, but it's in Chiapas. And so how do you, like, how do we then build, like, our own kind of revolutionary apparatus that's actually capable of contesting and overthrowing such a violent and bloody and powerful apparatus? And so I'm curious, kind of maybe to hear a little bit more about what you think that looks like and how to not be kind of a sea of whatever that vision looks like, that's not just kind of overtaken or local in a way that can be broken.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking of Maria Mies, in one of the last section on patriarchy and accumulation, she asks why socialist movements and also national liberation movement, like the movement of the Vietnamese, anti-colonial, why in a sense they've not kept the promise, right? Well, I think in the case of Vietnam, it's a special case because Vietnam was so destroyed that they actually had very little possibility except accepting, horrible conditions by international powers. 75% of the country was destroyed. So, but Maria Mies argues that, and I want to propose it to you, to me is somewhat convincing, that these ideas of a socialist and liberation movement, that to a great extent they have not kept the promise because they have embraced the same kind of idea of what development is like that I have seen in capitalist country, with the idea that you can actually have the same kind of development, but steer it in a more egalitarian way, right? So that you can have the same drive, for example, to oil extraction, to technological development, etc., but that somehow you will use the revenues, etc., in a more egalitarian, and that has not worked. Because once you enter into that kind of project, inevitably you are then in an orbit that immediately commodifies those decisions, that immediately pulls you. For example, Venezuela has lived a lot in terms of oil extraction. Right? Oil extraction has been one of the great revenues. One of the things that I'm thinking of, right? It's not, so I would say that one thing about the Zapatistas is that they have tried to actually have a more subsistence-based model, right? Not a model that is built on technological development, which of course they couldn't even aspire to, but a model that is built on more creating community, more using the land, going back to the land, necessarily, industrialization, etc. So that's one possibility that I would offer. And clearly also the pull of the international context is very important. But we see the so-called progressive government in the south, like Morales in Bolivia, right? Who, however, are making all kinds of deals over the lithium with international companies. And once you begin to do that, then these are not just isolated decisions. In a sense, you're pulled into a much wider world of commodification. That's done. And the other question, tell me, your practical, that's right. Remind me that,
Yes, just like being inundated into alienation, what does coalition look like practically?
Yeah, what does coalition...
And then about co-option.
Yeah, I think in terms of coalition, so definitely, I think that there's been a perversion of political life through the NGOs. I know that in the 70s nobody thought that there was any connection between money and politics, between movement and money. This came much later, was part of the neoliberalization. The movement too was neoliberalized. Remember, the NGOs is very interesting to understand, to study the history of NGO, the non-governmental institution, until the 80s. And NGOs were really like big, the Ford Foundation was an NGO, right? They were really big capitalist institution, right? They were non-government, but they had a lot of power. Then, it's really with the IMF structural adjustment that the NGO becomes ubiquitous. And why? Because the IMF, as a condition to countries almost across the world, is that you dismantle state-provided services. You dismantle universal medical care. You dismantle, anything that has to do with the generalized. And then enters the NGO. And the NGO will provide medical care, right? Will provide, but on a very selective basis. The role of the NGOs is actually a very selective and divisive, because they will decide, which are the people, which are not the people. Pretty much also like the evangelical sects, I was in Brazil in October, and one of the things that shocked me was the overwhelming presence of these evangelical sects, which have been really the ground force for Bolsonaro. And I've really images and stories, and many murderous stories too. For example, a year ago in Mato Grosso, this woman, Sebastiana Gauto, a woman from the Guarani community who was fighting against the companies coming in, taking over land that belonged to the community, to the Guarani community, to turn it into soya, the cultivation of soya. And she was accused of being a witch, and she was burned alive. They actually burned their house, she and her companion, to the ground, accusing her of being a witch. Actually, it was because she was opposing the privatization of land. But back to the NGOs, they came in to provide certain services, which is what the evangelical group do. In communities where there is nothing, they come in and they provide certain services, and they attract certain people. But then, of course, they have a whole process. It's not a universal entitlement. The NGO comes into the scene to replace the universal entitlement and to make entitlement part of a deal. What you give and who are you, how do you behave, right? Very important. So I think the NGO is not a path. I think NGO, and of course one has to, I don't want to be dogmatic and say, oh no, never an NGO, right? But politically, I don't think that's a path to real change. Huh? And pragmatically, I think how you build community. I think there are many examples historically, of community building. I mean, one that has become very famous and now a lot of people are re-evaluating was, the Black Panthers, breakfast program, right? Which was very, very popular. And in fact showed the continuity between political activism, between opposition, but at the same time also construction. It showed an understanding that you cannot simply say no. You also have to construct something positive. You also have to build something of the new society in the present. You cannot keep postponing the revolution to a future that never comes. It has to be built now. And that begins to actually bringing people together. Actually with making available, by bringing together, by collectivizing, bringing available resources that would not otherwise be available. And I think we have a lot of really important, that is one example, and they're going on, taking place now also in many communities, right? Care cooperative. And in New York, I know, for example, of people who are now trying to create in Harlem autonomous forms of healthcare, right? Autonomous forms, so that you don't have to immediately go to the hospital or immediately go to a doctor. There was a healthcare movement in the United States in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. And it was inspired by the distrust that people had in doctors. Basically, they thought it was a proletarian movement, it was a working class. People thought, oh, doctors, they only care for money. And the slogan was, every person a doctor. And every person a doctor meant coming together and trying to figure out something about health. Trying to figure out something about health. That, for example, is taking place a lot in places where I've been, in Argentina, in Ecuador. The issue of healthcare, of passing around, recuperating more traditional forms of medical knowledge, and also passing around information, that old process that women, for instance, have done for generations, right? There's a whole, every time you have to deal with the life of another person, I assure you, if you care for another person for a considerable amount of time, you become a bit of a medical expert. Because you have to understand a lot of things about the body. You have to understand a lot of things, body and soul. There's a lot you have to understand. So that collectivizing of knowledge about health, not only planting food in the community, a communal garden, which becomes immediately a place of sociality, but also the other kind of garden, which has to do with healthcare, with putting together our knowledge, learning. And I know that people in New York also include doctors who are very aware of all the limits of the hospital, all the limits of the medical system. Of course, if you have a heart attack, you go to the hospital. We are not in the position, we are able to actually provide that kind of service. But there's a lot that people can, especially around prevention, right? So I will keep that in mind. And there was a third one. Yes. Yes.
I asked about misogyny and organizing.
Oh, misogyny. Yes. Yeah. Well, I think I always say, this has always been my line. Don't try to educate men. That's a waste of time. Education comes in another way. Men became feminists when they saw big demonstrations of women. When they saw that women had a strong power. Because they were able, there was a movement that was strong. It's really a disgrace that the feminist movement in the United States is such a low point. I mean, I remember the 70s, International Women's Day. There was thousands and thousands of women in New York. This year, maybe a few hundred. But, so not a question of education. Education is really building and putting, fighting against misogyny. Is working with other women to regain the sense of your struggle, the sense of your power, the sense of your possibility. I think that's the path. The path is not, it's the question of building your own community. Any other question, comments? Yes, of course. Yes.
As all people here of the next 7 generations, I'm curious for you as an elder, just like looking back on your life and the communities and places that you've been a part of. For us, as we're building new worlds and building new cultures, what are some of the things that you imagine wanting us to bring into the cultures that we're creating for the generations to come after us.
Yeah.
And also, I have a curiosity about, in the different communities that you've been a part of and seen and have been in connection with, when there is tension and conflict and when things get really challenging, what are some of the things that you have seen work really well for staying committed to the vision of possibility and to what we're creating, and really like staying committed to that vision and creating together?
Right. Okay, maybe I'll have two this time. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you for making all the connections between memory, history, right, that, and what I've heard through all that was awareness. And we've seen that Biden and major news outlets have lied about certain things happening in Gaza or in Sudan, or other places that we see similar to Palestine and the Palestinian struggle, right? So, other than following certain people that I know that at Smith College there was a sit-in, or in Columbia there's a sit-in also right now taking place, and students are getting arrested.
Yeah, 100, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Other than following individual folks that are taking individual time to bring that awareness and not institutional, right, type of awareness, who do you trust and or follow, and what kind of lens or framework do you use when you're deciphering so much information?
Yeah. So the question about there were two questions, right? I would say one of the things that has been very important in my life. I mean, there are many things that have been important. I spoke about the war, right? And the war is very informative. The encounter with the feminist movement. I would say the feminist movement saved my life. I was very upset, angry, upset as a youth. I didn't see a prosperous future for myself because I was so angry with the world. But the feminist movement really gave me a sense that I could do something about it. That was an amazing, changed my life. And then one of the great change experiences I had in my life was 3 years that I spent in Africa. And that was like born again, if I can say that, because that experience resonated for years and years and years to come. In fact, in a sense, after that, all my talk about the IMF and war, I would not have had this very global, more global international perspective. I had some, but very abstract, and all became very, very real. I was in Nigeria in the very years in which there was a debate in the country about the IMF, because all of a sudden, the country, because of the dropping of the price of oil on the international market, all of a sudden the country had a debt. In the mid-70s, the price skyrocketed, so Nigeria borrowed huge amount of money, taking into account that this would continue. Then by 82, like with Mexico, Mexico went in bankruptcy in 82. The oil price collapses, and those loans at variable rates, this is the debt crisis. Anyway, so all of a sudden, my whole consciousness was raised. And also the experience of a colonized situation, what it means colonialism, became very real, became not an abstraction that I read on. So this is one recommendation. I'm sure I could give many others, but this is one thing that don't move beyond, connect beyond, Now it's so much easier in a way, because we have Nigeria is in the US, Mexico is in the US, so the experience of connecting with other world is here with us. But then I think going beyond, the closed circle, I think this is fundamental. I don't know if you had the second question.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the second question was like, in the communities that you've been a part of or seen.
Oh, the crisis. Oh, I never had a good, but I would say that the solution to the crisis, I think, is very important. It's very important at one point. The crises are always political opportunities. Right? There are moments in which you have to decide, which side you're on, what is that you want to do. And so the crisis is a moment in which you can decide whether you stay, for example, in an organization and fight it out, whether that is really worth it and really makes it possible to progress positively, or if it is better to change. I had one of such crises, major crisis in my life, and going away, moving away, I think was the right decision that I made. But these are decisions that you have to make. Very often we begin with some people, we begin with some groups, and then we realize along the way that perhaps we don't think the same thing, that perhaps we understand something different. And at that moment there is the crossroad, Until all through the Renaissance, the crossroad was the place of decision. Right? There are moments of crossroads always in our lives, in which you have to decide which is the way. Yeah. And but there was another question. Where are you? Right. Yes, remind me again.
What kind of frameworks or landscape?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know. Right now I listen to Al Jazeera, so I listen to Democracy Now!, I talk to a lot of people. I think basically when you're if you build a part of a community, if you're not isolated, then you begin also to decide, where your trust goes to. I think that's a part of it, yeah. And there was a time I was listening not religiously, but I was listening to the evening news, even though I was listening to say what they want us to believe. I cannot even listen now anymore. I find it more and more I have to close it because I think it actually gives me too much stomach ache. And so even that has become, even the desire to know what they want us to know. I think I know enough about what they want us to know. Yes. Okay.
So on that note of stomach aches, first if we could give Silvia Federici another round of applause.